Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to present the work that our group has been doing over the past couple of years, looking at how we can use geophysical imaging methods to evaluate potential recharge sites. And this is work that a lot of people at our group at Stanford have been working on, and our group's led by Rosemary Knight. And then I also want to acknowledge some of our other co-authors at the state. So we've got Paul Gosling, as well as some folks from a company called CurveNote, which I will talk about in a little bit. And so my talk today is going to have three sections. We're going to start with a bit of an introduction and motivation for the methods we're using, and the data sets we've been collecting. And then I'm going to dive right into the research that we've done over the past few years, where we've been developing a workflow to go from our geophysical data and to create useful metrics and maps that can be used to evaluate potential recharge sites. And so right off the bat, I want to acknowledge the funding sources for that initial research. So we had funding from the Almond Board of California, as well as the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And what you see today wouldn't have been possible without their support. And then for the last section of this talk, I'm going to get into what we're currently doing, which is taking all of the research and the work that we've done over the past couple of years and turning it into a web-based, freely available software, so that anybody who has these sorts of geophysical data and wants to implement the workflow that we've developed will be able to easily do that. And that work's being funded by the Sustainability Accelerator in the Stanford School of Sustainability. So diving right into our motivation, I don't think I have to do much motivation for this crowd. Of course, the issue we're interested in is this problem of having more water being extracted than is naturally recharging. So we want to do some sort of managed aquifer recharge to supplement that natural recharge. And there's a lot of things we, of course, have to consider when we're trying to decide on where to do the managed aquifer recharge. But for the sake of our research and for the sake of this talk today, what I'm really focusing on is that question of how do you select a site so as to maximize both the quantity and the rate of recharge? What we really want is to be able to effectively get water in as quickly as possible, especially in cases where there's high costs associated with setting up a recharge operation, or there's risk associated with it not being successful. And so throughout this talk, if I say a site is good for recharge or bad for recharge, I'm really only referring to this question of how do you find the best sites to get water into the ground quickly. And in terms of the geologic character of a good site, what we're really looking for is sites that have interconnected pathways of coarse-grained materials, because those are the materials that the water can rapidly move through and get down to the water table, as opposed to sites that have lots of fine-grained materials, clay layers that would act as barriers to flow. And so in order to evaluate potential recharge sites, what we really need is a way to locate these pathways quickly, reliably, and cost-effectively. Now, this sort of subsurface site characterization would traditionally be done with things like wells or boreholes, which give you really fantastic point information, like direct measurements of the sediment type below the surface. But the issue is we know that the subsurface can be really complicated, and oftentimes you just don't have enough of these points in order to understand what's going on beneath the surface. And so that's where we come in with our geophysical imaging methods, which can allow us to fill the gaps between our well data or our boreholes and get more of a continuous picture of what the subsurface looks like and how it's varying, which could help us understand where these connected pathways are. So the specific methods I'm going to be talking about are TTEM, which is a towed electromagnetic method, and the SkyTEM system, or AEM, which is an airborne electromagnetic method. And both of these methods are making the exact same measurement. So you've got a transmitter loop, which is being used to eject a signal into the earth, and you're measuring the response of the sediments in the subsurface to that signal, and you're using a receiver. And the response you measure can be used to create a model of the electrical resistivity of the subsurface. And electrical resistivity is a really great property to measure if you're interested in hydrogeologic questions, because it varies depending on some key factors that we're often interested in. So that includes the sediment type, specifically how much clay you have in the system, as well as the water content and the salinity of that water in your pore space. So we have these two methods that can be used to make models of electrical resistivity. How do they differ? Why would you use one versus the other? Well, the TTEM is smaller and it's towed on the ground surface. And because of that, you have better resolution at the ground surface. Your resolution does degrade with depth. So the values I have here are kind of your ideal scenario right at the surface. But the downside of this system is that you've got a shallower depth of investigation. So we can see down about 40 to 60 meters on average. And so this is really suited for site-specific or a local scale evaluation of what's going on in the subsurface. In contrast, the AEM system, it's much bigger. It's towed beneath a helicopter, so you can cover a lot more ground quickly, and you can see deeper, down to about 300 meters. But the trade-off there is that your resolution's not as good as with the TTEM system. And so these two are both allowing you to image the subsurface, but at different scales. And so we think they're really great complements to each other. Our group actually started working with the AEM system first. And so in 2015, my PI, Rosemary, got a really fantastic last-minute opportunity to collect AEM data somewhere in the state of California. And she quickly scrambled to find a local partner to help facilitate this project, to find an interesting project to apply this to. And they were able to, I think it's in just 2 weeks, plan a survey, which is pretty remarkable. So for those of you who haven't seen these AEM systems before, this is what it looks like. You've got your transmitter loop that's suspended beneath the helicopter, and here it is taking off from the Tulare airfield. And the data that we were able to get from that survey look like this. So here we have models of electrical resistivity of the subsurface, where in red we have high resistivity, which corresponds to sand and gravel dominated materials, and in blue, low resistivity that corresponds to clay materials. And this survey is massive. These lines extend over 20 kilometers. And this is just, I think, a day or two worth of data that you're seeing here. And so I think I can speak for everyone in our group. We were just blown away when we got these data back. I mean, you're very clearly seeing the upper aquifer, the Corcoran clay, the lower aquifer. You can see where the clay layer pinches out, and you likely have some connection between the upper and lower aquifer. And to be able to see this level of detail in the subsurface with data that was collected so quickly was just remarkable. And we were really encouraged by the potential this had to understand recharge pathways, as well as a whole slew of different hydrogeologic questions that you might be able to start investigating with these data sets. And so this really motivated our group to work on AEM in general. And so here are just some of the other surveys that our group has been involved in since that initial survey in Tulare. And some of these include the pilot studies, which were part of planning the workflow for the current DWR AEM survey. And so while we really love the AEM data, it's very useful for all sorts of hydrogeologic questions and problems. When it came to recharge, we recognized that it is useful for big picture identifying where you might want to target your recharge operations. But when you get into questions like, how do I pick an individual site, or even a subset of a site that you might want to berm off to do recharge, it just doesn't have the resolution to be used in that way, which is why we were really excited in October of 2017 when we had the opportunity to fly over the TTEM system from Denmark, which is just a scaled down version of that AEM system. And so, again, we found local partners that we could work with to find sites. So Aaron Pakuda and Tulare Irrigation District helped us get access to some sites. And we used this to try to understand the subsurface at some potential recharge sites. So here it is in a almond grove down in Tulare Irrigation District. And we were just thrilled by kind of how perfect the system was for this problem. It fit perfectly between our rows of trees, and we were able to really rapidly collect data over entire sites. And here's what these data look like. So just like with the AEM, we're looking at electrical resistivity, where red is our high resistivity corresponding to sands and gravels, and blue is our low resistivity corresponding to clay-dominating materials. And this is fantastic. We're seeing a huge amount of variation in the resistivity of the subsurface, but at a much smaller scale. So we're just at an individual almond site, and we can see that within this single site, we have so much variability. It looks like we might have a sand-dominated channel here. that's in a background of more fine-grained material. And so we knew this had huge potential to start understanding individual sites, understanding where you might want to target recharge on a single site. And so we went on to collect hundreds more line kilometers of TTEM data throughout the Central Valley to begin working with to understand how we can use these data to address the issue of recharge site assessment. And so that brings me to the second part of the talk, where I'm going to talk you through what we've actually been doing with all these data sets we've collected. And so what we've done is we've developed a workflow where we can go from our resistivity models, either basin scale models derived from the AEM data or smaller local scale models derived from the TTEM data, and use the same workflow to convert those models of resistivity to models of sediment texture, specifically to models of coarse-grained fraction, so either 0%, which is all fine-grained, or 100%, which is all coarse-grained, and then to interrogate those models to find our interconnected pathways of coarse-grained material where recharge might effectively occur, and evaluate them using different metrics and create maps which we can use to cite our recharge sites. So I'm going to walk you through this workflow at two different scales. So I'm going to start at the basin scale in the Kuya Basin, so down in the San Joaquin Valley. And in this basin, we had a fantastic AEM data set that we collected in 2018. And so here, again, we're really clearly seeing the large-scale hydrostratigraphic structure of our basin. So we see our upper aquifer, the Corcoran clay, and the lower aquifer down below. We can see where this Corcoran clay pinches out, and your aquifers then become connected. And as we move further towards the east, we can see that in the foothills, we've got bedrock, which is outcropping, and which dives down to depth as you get into the basin. So clearly, the resistivity model is seeing lots of the important sediment type, the structure of the subsurface. And so we want to turn this into a model of sediment type and find those connected pathways which could be used for recharge. Now, you'll recall that I told you that resistivity depends on a number of things, including sediment type and water content and salinity. So it's that sediment type that we want. We want to transform from resistivity to sediment type, but we have to control for water content and salinity. And so our approach to this is to segment our resistivity model into multiple zones. And the goal is to be able to zone it enough so that within each individual zone, we can assume water content isn't changing and salinity isn't changing, so that any variation we see in resistivity can be attributed to changing sediment type. So the first step in our workflow is to compile all the data we need to zone our model and create our transform. So of course, we start with our resistivity model. Then we want to get water quality data so that we can zone the model based on water quality if need be. So there's a number of sources you could use to get that data. And in this case, for the Kuya Subbasin, we're actually not zoning based on water quality because we don't expect it to have a big impact in this situation, but we have worked on other data sets where it would be really important. So for example, some of the data we have along the coast where we have saltwater intrusion, it's very clear that you would need to separate your model based on water quality. Next, we want to get water table data so that we can zone the model based on saturation. And whenever possible, it's best to get this data at the same time as the AEM survey. But if you're not able to do that, of course, there's other resources you can use to get an estimation of the water table. So in the case of our Kuya Subbasin example, we've got 61 water table measurements that were collected at the same time as our AEM survey. We can interpolate those to get a surface for the water table elevation and then segment our resistivity model based on that. So now we have a unsaturated zone and a saturated zone. And lastly, we need the sediment type data that we're actually going to use to build our transform in each of those two zones that we've now identified. And so what we want is we want sediment type information that has a binary classification as either being fine or coarse. And so generally for our basin scale assessments, this information is going to be coming from drill logs. At the local scale, you might use cores or CPT. And you'll likely have to do some sort of classification to go from that native format into this binary description. Another really important thing is we need to have very accurate locations for these logs. So in the Kauai subbasin, we had 133 logs where we had very accurate location, where we were able to digitize and classify the logs. And so the orange dots here are showing where those logs are in relation to our AEM flight lines in black. And then this is just an example of one of the logs. So in red and blue, you can see the fine and coarse. And then overlaid on that in black is the nearest AEM resistivity model. So the next step in our workflow is to actually develop our transform to go from resistivity to sediment type. And so in order to do this, we're going to pair up our resistivity data and our sediment type data. And any place we have co-located data sets, we're going to be working with those. And so in this case, we define co-location as being within 400 meters separation distance. And that separation distance is something you can play with when you develop your own transform. You want to make it as small as possible so that you can make the assumption that that sediment type log is a valid representation of the subsurface that your AEM system is measuring. In practice, the smaller you make that distance, usually the less data pairs you have, because you're not always able to fly exactly over your wells. And so that's just something you have to play around with and find the right balance for. Once we have those data pairs, we're now able to say, okay, at any given point where I have a AEM resistivity value from my resistivity model, I likely have many interbedded layers of coarse and fine-grained sediments from my sediment type log. And I can model the physics of the AEM measurement through all of those individual layers using a parallel circuit model, which is this equation down here. And so we know the thicknesses of all of these individual layers, and we know our AEM resistivity, but what we don't know is the resistivity values associated with those coarse-grained layers and those fine-grained layers. But what we can do is we can write out this equation everywhere we have those data pairs, and we can solve for those values using a bootstrapping approach. And we do this in each of our zones, so both above and below the water table. And what we get out of that is a distribution of resistivity values associated with our coarse-grained material and our fine-grained material. And we have that both above and below the water table. And this is the data we need to build our transform. So we can again take our parallel circuit model, and we can plug in a value for resistivity of coarse-grained materials and a value of resistivity for fine-grained materials taken from those distributions. And we can say, for every possible coarse fraction, what resistivity value would the AEM system measure? And we can use that to build this mapping function here, or our transform that we're going to use. And so our next step is to apply that transform. We will interpolate our resistivity models onto a 3D grid. We can apply that transform, and again, we have a separate transform in each of our different zones, so above and below the water table. And the product we get is a 3D model of the coarse fraction of the subsurface. And this model is kind of an intermediate product in our workflow, but it can be quite useful to look at and start getting an idea about what's going on in the subsurface at this basin scale. So you could choose to look at different depth slices. So here we're looking just at the surface, and then one vertical section here where we cut the model off at the water table. Or perhaps more useful, you can choose to look at the integrated coarse fraction from the surface down to the water table. And so what this is showing is that there's some areas where it's entirely coarse through that whole interval, and then other areas where you've got fine-grained material, which would likely be a barrier to flow for recharge. This product is useful, but of course we know that you can have flow through connected pathways in all dimensions. And so, what this fails to capture is that you might have flow that goes down into the surface and then moves around fine-grained layers. And we want to be able to capture that. And so the next step in our workflow, the last step in our workflow, is to generate metrics by which we can locate and evaluate those interconnected pathways in our coarse-grained model. And so there's a number of different metrics you could choose to use to evaluate these models. So we're going to present two here today. But if, as you listen to this, if you think of anything else that you would want to be able to look at and calculate from these models, keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that in the discussion at the end. So the first metric is, what is the shortest path length through your connected coarse-grained material from the surface down to the water table? And the second metric is, what is the depth to the shallowest low permeability layer that water would encounter? And this is important because a thick clay layer that's a meter beneath the surface is going to have a much bigger impact on your recharge operation than that same clay layer if it were, say, 30 meters below the ground surface. So these are the two metrics we want to calculate. And in order to rapidly do that in an efficient way, we want to take our coarse fraction model and convert it into a binary model that describes each cell in the subsurface as being either high permeability or low permeability. And that's really easy to do. All we need to do is pick a coarse fraction threshold above which we say we are treating the material as high permeability and below which we treat it as low permeability. And that threshold is something that the user can decide based on the decision they're trying to make or their risk tolerance. And so, for example, if you absolutely could not risk having water pond at the surface, you might want to say, if there's any amount of clay in the system, I want to treat it as low permeability. And so you set that threshold quite high. Whereas if you weren't so worried about ponding and you just wanted to make sure you identified every possible connected pathway, you might set that threshold quite low. Or maybe you choose to test multiple thresholds and see how that would impact the decision you made. Regardless, once you pick a threshold, you can turn your model into a binary model, and then we can calculate our two metrics on that model. So here is the path length of the water table for our Kauai sub-basin example. This was calculated using a fast-marching algorithm to solve the Kyle equation. And what we're looking at here is areas in green and yellow where you have fast pathways down to the water table. In this case, the water table is between about 20 and 40 meters depth. So here you have mostly vertical or near vertical pathways from the surface to the water table. Whereas as soon as we get into the red area and we've kind of saturated this color scale at 100 meters, that means that you have your water would have to move laterally a lot in order to find pathways down to the water table. And it's really highlighting a zone in the middle here, which would likely be best for recharge. We can also look at our second metric, the depth of the shallowest locate unit. And you can see in red here, there's places where you've got that impermeable unit right at the surface, where there's other areas where that unit is not encountered until you get pretty close to the water table. And when you compare all of our different maps, you can see they're roughly highlighting the same area, but there are some differences. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say there might be different metrics that people are interested in, depending on what your concerns are or what decision you're trying to make. You might want to look at various different metrics to make your decision. And could they highlight slightly different areas that would be ideal for recharge? Okay, so we can see that this would be useful for at the big basin scale, figuring out where you should start targeting your efforts in order to select recharge sites. But of course, like I said, we don't have the resolution with the AEM to start making hyper-local decisions, which is why we want to transition to our local scale example. And just to put that in perspective, our local site is also in the Tulare Irrigation District. It's at this Clarkland site here, and the whole site only covers 2 cells in this basin scale model, so much finer scale. Oops. So now starting with our local scale example, it's a almond grove, and it's actually the data set that you've already seen. So here we've got our TTEM data, and we also have an estimation of the water table at about 40 meters. And if we jump right into our workflow, we can pull in our sediment type data. And in this case, we're using CPT. So we've got 5 CPT logs that are all within 10 meters of a resistivity model. And in this case, we're also assuming water quality is not varying much at the site. So with all our data compiled, we can develop our rock physics transforms. So here we've got those distributions associated with fine and coarse grained materials that we've calculated. In this case, we're only transforming above the water table because our CPT data didn't extend below the water table. And we can only build a transform where we have data to support building it. And if we jump straight to our integrated coarse fraction model that we get from transforming that resistivity model, this is what we get. So we can see that there's parts of this field where we've got pretty coarse material all the way down to the water table, and then other parts where it's much finer. And when we start slicing and dicing that model, you can see how complicated the structure is at this site. So you've got packages of coarse-grained materials interbedded with these layers of fine-grained materials. And in particular, we can see there's this pretty pervasive fine-grained layer, which is right above the water table, which is at 40 meters, which might be a barrier for flow down to the water table, which is why it's important to be able to interrogate and find the location of those pathways. Well, when we calculate our path length to the water table, this is what we get. Again, 40 meters is our water table, so anywhere where it's dark green, it's a straight shot down to the water table. And then as we get into our reds and oranges, that water would have to take a much more circuitous route to get to the water table. And similarly, we can look at our depth of shallowest low K unit, and we can see that all of these are kind of highlighting slightly different parts of the field depending on what we're interested in. And so if you were to want to do recharge at the site, you might want to look at these and kind of figure out a subset of the site that you might want to burn off and target for recharge, maybe doing that rather than recharging the entire site. All right, so that is a rapid fire step through the workflow that we've developed for using these geophysical data to do recharge site assessment. And we have published this. It's an open access journal, so anyone can read those publications. But we recognize that just because it's open access doesn't mean that anyone could easily use it and access it. And so that's why we wanted to take this a step further and actually turn all of our research code into a software that was much easier to implement and use for anyone who might be interested. And we're also developing an online course to go along with that software in order to support the use of it. So I'm going to talk a bit about this software. This is definitely kind of early days. We've just started this project, but I want to give you a feel for what we're doing and what the software looks like. So we're developing this in collaboration with a company called CurveNote. And so the Stanford group is really responsible for figuring out what we want the workflow to look like and refining the code to actually run the computation that the software will be doing. And then CurveNote is going to be working with us to, make it into a web-based software, build the GUI, the user interface, the visualization to really make it easy and accessible to anyone who wants to use it. And they're also going to be kind of putting a wrapper around that workflow I described to you before. And so they'll also enable the ability for users to log in, to browse the data, upload their own data, run our workflow, and then also save and download, all the things you want out of a fully functioning software. So in terms of the architecture of this, like I said, it's going to be a web-based software, and that platform is going to be interacting with the Stanford Cloud, where we will be hosting the server as well as a database that has all of the geophysical data as well as the supporting other supporting information that's publicly available from DWR. And it'll also have all of Stanford's data sets, the AEM and the TTEM data set that we've been working with. And then we'll also be hosting the cloud computing required to run the software. And so we're not expecting anyone to be doing this on their own computers. A bit more of a detailed look at how this will be implemented. So the user will be allowed to explore the data sets that we have available. We'll also likely have available some of these metric maps that we've already calculated based on those data sets. And so perhaps someone just wants to directly download those, which they can do, or they might want to run our workflow, in which case they can set that up. Once they're ready to go, we'll launch a compute session, again, on the Stanford Cloud. No one's going to be expected to do that themselves, and run through this transform, and you can download at various points in this workflow. So here's a look at the timeline for our partners at CurveNote. We started this project in August this year, and they've been focusing to date on kind of making sure it's feasible to take our research codes and turn them into something useful to interact with our database. And now they're on to building wireframes, which is kind of the outline of what this application is going to look like, what the user interface is going to look like, what visualizations are going to be available. And once we finalize those, they're going to move on to developing the application and testing and refining it. And the final product will be available by September of 2023. And you'll note this timeline, there's a couple of places where we have this partner feedback noted. And that leads me to kind of the third group of people involved with this project, and those are our project partners. So these are all of our project partners on this. They represent a diverse range of backgrounds from the state, local water agencies, consulting companies, nonprofits. And our goal in pulling in all of these partners is to get feedback from them, involve them kind of in the co-collaboration, co-creation of this software, so that we can really be making a product that's as useful as possible for all of the potential, either direct users of the software or people who might be using the final product that comes out of it. And so we're working with them to help inform all of the decisions we make in how we implement the workflow, as well as how we make the software look and feel, so that we can get the best possible product out of this. So, like I said, this is very early days, and we're just mapping out what this all looks like. But for the very last part of my talk here, I'm going to run through just some slides showing what this software right now is expected to look and feel like. All of this is subject to change based on the feedback we get, but this will give you kind of a feel for what it looks like if you're actually going to go and use it. So we'll have some sort of landing page, and in that you'll be able to either sign in or sign up. And you'll sign up just to give us a little bit of information about who's using the software, but most importantly, so that you can come back to your account down the line and access any work that you've already done and re-download it if you're interested. And once you're signed in, you're going to be dropped into a GIS interface that will allow you to explore all the data that we have available in that database that I spoke about. And so in this case, we're just looking at all the DWR AEM lines. So you can move around, see what data sets are available that you might want to work with. And once you've decided, okay, I want to do this, I want to run this workflow, you'll set up all the data sets that you need to do that. So you can either select from the data sets that we already have available in the database, or you might choose to upload your own data. And if you're uploading your own data, you'll be able to keep that private, so it won't be accessible by others. Once you have your data set, you're going to go ahead and launch your compute session on the Stanford Cloud. And the first page you'll have is one where you can explore all those data that you've selected to work with. So you can look at your resistivity models, you can look at all your well data, you could toggle through all the different wells that you're pairing up with your resistivity data and adjust that collocation radius and see how that's impacting results. You can look at your water table, elevation, and how that's comparing with your different data sets. And once you're happy with all the data that you're going to be involving in this workflow, you can go on to the next step of actually running the rock physics transform. And so will automatically calculate those distributions and solve for the rock physics transform that you'll be using. I didn't really talk about this here, but there will be some ability to explore the uncertainty by sampling different values from these distributions if you're interested. And once you're happy with your transform, you'll just go ahead and apply that to your resistivity model. And you'll be able to look at the coarse fraction model that comes out of that. So here we're looking at coarse fraction. You can move through different depth slices and look at different profiles. You could also toggle this to show integrated coarse fraction if you're interested in it, or you can draw lines and look at more complicated profiles if you want to. And if this is the only product that you're interested in, you could choose to just stop here and download these results. You can even kick it back into that GIS viewer and see how that overlays with the data sets that went into creating that layer. Or you might say, okay, I want to go on to the next step and actually generate those recharge metric maps. In which case you'd be dropped into this page where here, for example, we're looking at distance to the shallowest snowflow layer. And you can look at a number of different things here. So we can toggle what we're looking at. So if you're looking at multiple different models, if you're sampling that uncertainty in the transform, which I said I didn't really have time to get into, you could toggle between those. You can adjust the coarse fraction threshold that you're using to go from that continuous coarse fraction model to the binary model that we use to calculate these metrics. So you can play around with that. You can change your color bar. You can contour the data at different levels if you want. And you can play around with these as much as you want and save different instances, which you can then toggle between to see how that would impact the maps you're creating. And you can do this for this metric, or you can look at other metrics like the depths of the path length to the water table. And once you're happy with all of that, you can export your final product. And down the road, if you want to come back and see those results again, it'll all be saved in a session history in your account. And so you can access those at any time. So that's a real quick look at the software. Again, we're just in the initial stages of it now and figuring out what we want the user to be able to do and how we want it to look so that it's most useful. And so I'm going to wrap up with these questions here. And these are actually some of the questions that we posed to our project partners at our kickoff meeting recently. And the goal of talking through these questions with them was really to understand who the users are going to be, what data set they might have, what products are going to be most useful for them, etc. And again, the goal is really to make sure that this is something that's actually useful for people in the community. And so already just from the one meeting we had, we've got a huge amount of really useful feedback. For example, for question number 2, what metrics do you want? Already we're going to be adding one metric where instead of just the path length to the water table, we'll have path length normalized by depth to the water table. So things as big as new metrics to things like, I want to be able to change what the color scale looks like. So we'll have options to change the color scale. Really, we're interested in feedback at kind of all levels. And so while we're directly soliciting feedback from our key project partners, we're really interested in getting feedback from anyone who's interested in this problem. And I think that's pretty much everyone in this room. So if you've got any feedback on the project in general or these specific questions, I've set up a Google form where you can submit that to our team. And this is something that everyone in our team will have access to. And so we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in supporting this project and giving us any feedback. And with that, I'll wrap it up and have it open for discussion or any questions.
Thanks so much, Meredith. This is really amazing work. And you answered a lot of the questions that I started jotting down in your presentation. So now's the time in LunchMAR where we've got about 10 minutes to have a conversation, ask Meredith some questions, provide some comments. I see a lot of positive feedback in the chat. Welcome anyone to turn on their mics, turn on their cameras, and get in the queue with a raised hand. I'll be monitoring chat. I do see a question in the chat, so we can start there. Will there be capability to interact or merge this model with other models such as CBH or CBHM2?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We're kind of planning that on a number of different levels. I think one of the most interesting things that we might want to do is say, if I've already got a model of coarse fraction, for example, from CVHM, or if DWR is producing one that goes with their AEM data, can I run this workflow through their model? And that's something we'll definitely be enabling. And so that you can have various, if you don't like the way we do our resistivity transform, you could do your own. You could come at it with your own coarse fraction model and calculate the metrics based on that. So that's one way that you'll be able to use it. And then also anyone will be able to export the final product and kind of integrate it with any other recharge site assessment tools you might have. So I know that CVHM is often used with other site evaluation tools. And so you could plug in our results with that.
Great. Thank you. Another question coming in the chat. And sorry, folks, this is not in any order. I'm just reading them off as they pop in front of my face. Will there be ability to do 2D or 3D inversions through, say, an API in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you'll note that the starting point for this workflow is a resistivity model. And for those of you who don't know, inversion is the process that you run through to go from the data that you measure to actually create that resistivity model. And so in this case, we aren't actually integrating the inversion into the workflow. There's a number of reasons for that. If we did that, it would require a much more expert user, and then also your computational time would skyrocket. And so we're not including inversion, but there are lots of resources you could use if you wanted to, include inversion and uncertainty inversion into this workflow before running through our software. And we have explored a couple of ways to do that. And there's some papers I can point people to that are published showing how to do that. But no, inversion will not be part of this.
Do you have a timeline that you guys have developed and making the web-based application available? Or is that still part of kind of the scoping and better understanding the final product?
Yeah, so this is a one-year project. That's kind of the goal of our funding source, is really to accelerate research into practical applications. And so it will be available by September 2023. And so that's the timeline for our product to be available. And then we're going to be ingesting the DWR, AEM, and the supplementary data, so like the well data that they have to bring along with it, as soon as it's released. So if all of the DWR, AEM isn't released by then, I don't remember what their timeline is, we'll import it as soon as it's released.
Great, thank you. There was a comment in here with a new acronym, TPROGs. It would be, Merdad had mentioned that it'd be interesting to compare the heterogeneity with these results and TPROGs outcomes. So yeah, just explain what TPROGs is for the group and say if there was any comparison.
Yeah, so I haven't used TPROGs myself, but my understanding is TPROGs is like a geostatistical modeling software where you can take point location information like those well data and build a complicated 3D model, which attempts to capture the uncertainty that you have in between those point measurements. And so, yeah, there's definitely ways you could integrate the two. We haven't explicitly added that into our workflow, but we have looked at, instead of just doing interpolations of our resistivity data and then transforming it, we have added geostatistical modeling in some of our research codes. We used a different software, not TPROGs, but that's something that if people are interested in, I encourage you to look at our research papers because we have looked at that. But I think it's a little too complicated for the basic user, so we haven't put it into our software.
Well, I could make a comment on that. So I think it's possible that between the borehole data and the AEM and TOTEM data, you'll be able to define the system well enough that it's more deterministic than stochastic. In other words, if you're really successful, there might not be a lot of uncertainty in the model you create. However, if there is uncertainty, and there likely will be any geostatistical model like TPROGs or perhaps multi-point geostatistics could be helpful to use in conjunction with these data.
Yeah,
it's depends on the conditions and the circumstances.
Yeah, and that's a good point. When we talk about uncertainty in our model or in our transform, anything like that, kind of our approach to uncertainty is to really look at the decision you're trying to make, look at the risk tolerance you have, and decide whether it's worth diving deeper and quantifying that uncertainty or trying to minimize that uncertainty, if it'll actually impact your decision or it'll be risky not to quantify it. And so there's definitely additional steps you could take beyond the workflow we presented to minimize uncertainty if that's a concern.
I think this work's incredibly important, and I really like how you developed a workflow to better integrate the borehole data and the EM data. The EM data is great for getting you horizontal continuity that the borehole data cannot give you, but the borehole data, even if it's not the best quality borehole data, is superior for giving you vertical information. So you really need to put the two together.
Yeah.
Thanks, Graham, for the input. Meredith, is there plans to do more TTEM surveys while you guys are working on this web application, or are you guys primarily focused on kind of gathering all the information that's out there to get the web application developed by this time next year?
Yeah, so I think we've got a couple more TTEM surveys planned as part of kind of our broader research goals beyond just this. But there's also private companies that are running TTEM surveys. Tulare Irrigation District runs their own TTEM surveys. And so we're not the only ones doing this. I don't think we have kind of a huge number on in the future for us immediately now. This workflow's, at this point, it's pretty well established. We're not really needing to collect more data sets and analyze how to do it. It's more about figuring out how we can cater the workflow to be most useful for our end users.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for another question or two. Again, I welcome folks to turn on their cameras and join the conversation. I saw a question about SAGB. Will this effort be at all integrated with SAGB?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we've thought about a number of different ways to do this. One suggestion from one of our local partners was maybe we have a metric that looks at both our model as well as the SAGB, and we have some combined metric. So that's something we might do. But we're a little hesitant to start kind of pulling in everybody else's different recharge assessment metrics into this tool, because really we want to make sure that the tool is being used kind of in the right way and that we're not selectively only bringing in some data sets and not others. And so really our goal is to have a final product that can be then exported and imported into whatever else you're using to do your site assessment. And so maybe down the line, either the folks at SAGB who are developing SAGB or anyone else who's working with those data sets would want to combine what we put out from this product with the soil type information and the root zone residence, all the other things into a new product. And if that's something that someone wants to do, they should definitely get in touch, and we can make sure whatever we output from our software is compatible with how people want to integrate it with all these other information sources.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. And I see in the chat, Catherine from DWR has included links to current AEM information on DWR's website. So thank you, Catherine. All right. Well, I think we're getting close on time. Again, want to remind folks about our last conversation this month on DIY climate change approaches and kind of cross-pollination work that people are doing in other research areas with the conversations that we've been having in water management, California, and LunchMAR specifically. And we have one more LunchMAR this year. We'll be talking about a fun new topic on BeaverMAR and how beavers can support river restoration and groundwater recharge. So looking forward to that. So stay tuned for your calendars and seeing the update. And we'll likely cancel the January LunchMAR since it's so close to people's finishing up some holiday breaks. So we'll reconvene in 2023 with our February LunchMAR on Water Data Consortium. So looking forward to that as well. And Meredith, again, great work. Very interesting application. I can see how it would be very useful to the FloodMAR community, and I look forward to working with you as this continues over the next year. So thank you so much. Have a great November. Bye all.
Yeah.